Fionnán.
Hello, Paul. Can you hear me? Good morning.
Yeah, is it morning?
I know. Well, sometime between 1965 and 1985. I'm still catching up.
Fionnán, do you know what, Fionnán? I'm in the other room today. I'm doing some other tastings, but you have the floor today. These guys are going to keep you company. You've got a lot of people in this room today. Obviously, very excited about the second part of this. Morning, Barry Chandler. If Barry wants to come in at any point, he can. He can turn into a presenter for 5 minutes. I'll give Barry an opportunity to come into the chat. But Fionnán, I'm going to leave it with you. I mean, you have those great bottles. I mean, to be honest, I'm just looking at the lineup for today. So we've got, what have we got? We've got the Lock Secure, number 15. We've got a Paddy from the 1960s, which we've agreed on. We've got the Jameson 3-Star. Yep, from the 1950s. We've got a Club from the McKibben. And we've got White's 22 and a nice little Dunville's 3 Crown Special Liqueur from the 1930s, maybe 1940s. Yeah. I'm hot under the collar for that stuff. Like, I'm hot under the collar for that stuff. You know what I mean? But I'm going to have to love you and leave you. But Fionnán, enjoy your session. I hope everyone has
carry on. Just as long as it's not me shiting on if it's me talking into the void. We could be talking for a very long time.
Come on, listen. That's what I'm saying. We've got, I think Brendan Carty's there. He can come on for a bit of chat. Brendan can come in. I would happily have Brendan in for a little while, and if Barry wants to come in for a little while. So if the admins want to help out there and make sure they can come in, that's perfect. Because it's nice to have someone to bounce off with. Fionnán, okay?
Yeah, exactly.
Look, Brendan has a meeting at 2:40, but listen, we shall sort that out. Okay?
Grand.
Super. All right. I'll see you very soon. Listen, Fionnán, good luck. Buys in his pajamas. I told him I'd call him out in his jammies. Get him on here. In his jammies. Cheers.
Barry, you're on. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Grand. Okay. So yesterday, of course, we were doing pre-70s stuff. Today we're doing that, but just through chance as much as anything. We're going to talk a bit more about what happened during the 60s, just because a lot of the whiskeys here kind of speak to that. So some of the stuff we had yesterday was stuff that was bottled much later or was discovered or whatnot, whereas a lot of what we're having today is from the era itself. It's less of the Dungorneys that popped up in warehouses at 30-year age points. And I thought we'd start with the Bow Streeter. So that should be number 9, I believe. It's got a little Jameson on the side. So that's 7-year-old, what used to be called Jameson 3-Star. Why 3-Star should mean 7 years is still a bit of a mystery. But anyway, that was, it's one of the more visible kind of classic Bow Streeters, the not a drop sold till it's 7 years old. Give it a smell. And especially, I know some of you here were here yesterday where we had the Redbreast 10. And as I said then, whenever we do these old Jamesons or old Redbreast or old Green Spots, I think the fallacy is we try and compare them to modern Redbreast or modern Green Spot. And actually, they have a lot more to do with each other than they have to do with any of those descendant brands, because in truth, these are all products of Bow Street Distillery. And they're very close together. And so it can sometimes be kind of counterproductive to think, how did Redbreast change or how did Green Spot change? The brands are descendants, but the actual concoctions are really, of a separate family, a different branch of the family. And that family, when we talk about Bow Street Distillery, if I was to differentiate Powers from Bow Street, Powers is oily, it's dark, it tastes like shoe polish wrapped on apricots. It's very, very leathery. It's very, very dense. Again, the closest thing IDL make to their ancestor companies would be the kind of power style distillates. Nothing is really close to Bow Street that I can think of from IDL. Bow Street, it was thick, yes, but it's not really as oily. It's almost like a stiff texture. It's like a slightly gelatinous texture, and it smells like citrus. It tastes like citrus. Sometimes it's more citrine, orangey, and sometimes it's more leafy, but it's always somewhere in the like clementine pith spectrum. So this one, the 7-year-olds are a lot of fun because they can be a bit more variable, because again, the casks themselves were less dependable. So when they're younger, there's more differences emerging. Obviously, consistency is a very modern arrival. But give it a smell there. This one in particular, I was having a Bow Street not too long ago, thanks to the generosity of a friend. And this is drier, and that was the same exact 3-star bottle. But here, it's like pith. It's something between pith and leaf. You have to kind of really dig down for the citrus. The other thing I used to refer to as barley sugar. There's a weird sweetness in Old Bow Street. Give it a taste, and again, don't be afraid to take a slightly larger mouthful. You know, it is pot still. Get a bit of that texture. Treat it like it was meant to be. And that's where that. Again, it's that wonderful snap, crackle, gingery blur between kind of the clementine and the clementine's pith. It's weird, you know, when we think of sweet stuff, we think of either light and sweet or kind of, you know, sugary and sweet. Whereas this, it really is sweet and spicy. It manages to be pithy, which keeps it from just being overbearingly sweet. It's a different kind of sweetness. We don't often think of pot still as sweet, but the closest I've found would be a lot of these Old Bow Street. Is that strange? However it was happening. What do you think, Barry? Can you hear me?
It lives to the tongue. It doesn't get to the back. But I get that pith. I get that like the white underneath the skin of the orange.
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's that strange. I've never had citrus that's as dry as Bow Street is the best way I can put it. And it works really well with that strange kind of texture. A lot of people in Scotland go on about the texture of Clynelish and that, you know, again, beeswaxy, honeycomb, whatever it is, feeling. And, you know, pot still I usually think of as being like, again, oilier or weightier. A lot of people, myself included, went on and on about the Jameson 15 pot still that Middleton put out at the Millennium. And a lot of people say, oh, it's like the old Jameson. It's not a bit like the old Jameson, but it's lovely. And it is heavy by Middleton standards today. But old Jameson was not the heaviest that pot still got by any measure. But again, it works so well.
You know, what's the significance of the 3 stars? Could you explain the 3 stars and the kind of history of that?
There's a lot of, you know, people threw around this kind of gibberish, all, you know, with free hands. You might as well have put like Siskel and Ebert, give it, you know, 2 thumbs up. They're using words like liqueur, etc. And some of them mean more than others. You know, I've seen whiskey that was verifiably under 3 years old call itself liqueur whiskey. You know, a lot of these, there was no regulation. So they become, you know, a kind of a brand. When we start trying to get meaning from them, it's a very long and dark road. The only things we can really trust are statements like, you know, not a drop sold till it's 7 years old. Things like that tend to be relatively reliable. And this was 50s Bow Street. So there's a lot of, it's very easy to find stuff about Bow Street just because they were so public. They were the chairman of the Irish Pot Still Distillers Association. They, you know, the Jameson family were quite well off, were quite influential. Infamously, there's the What is Whiskey trial in 1908, where Jameson and James Talbot Powers are the 2 people summoned, or 2 of the people summoned to testify on behalf of Irish whiskey. And Andrew Jameson gives a breakdown of Irish practice, which is very, very useful when we look backwards. And he says, you know, and people can get very mysterious about old mash bills, but in truth, you know, there was what was considered kind of best practice in the trade. There's not a whole lot of mash bills from the 20th century. They tend to kind of hover around, say, three points, and a lot of the Dubliners had this again, like high malt content, or what they considered high malt content, which would be about 40 to 50% malt, then raw barley kicking in around 30 to 40%, oats about 15 to 20, wheat around 5, and then this really bizarre sprinkling of rye. And we're talking extremely, extremely low percentages of rye, about 1 to 3%. It's a huge mystery to me why anyone would bother at 1%. It must have done something. And Andrew Jemison, he's asked at one point, do you use only Irish grain? And he says, I think we only use Irish oats, but rye is a very difficult thing to find nowadays grown in Ireland. So he was fetching it when needed. So it did serve some sort of a purpose. But rye, which was always the most liminal, kind of drops off first. Now, when we're talking about the 50s, from the Irish Pot Still Distillers Association, from Jemison's own advertising, we see rye vanish from the records, and we're dealing with about, again, 40% malt, probably higher for some of the Dubliners, 40% raw barley, about 15% oats, and 5% wheat. The back of a lot of these labels used to say this product contains nothing other than barley, oats, and wheat. But again, it's when we demystify what was there. So a lot of them will be hovering around that spectrum. But again, in Dublin, you got a slightly higher malt content. So that may be where some of the sweetness is coming from. But again, we can only speculate backwards. It is lovely stuff. And it's almost like with some of them, I feel the same way about Cumber. It's like eating American Jell-O. It's this strange kind of vaguely solidinous textural grip. It kind of crumbles from a wonky solid into a liquid the longer you hold it in your mouth. And modern pot still doesn't do that. And I have no idea why that happened. Was it the distilling? Was it the oats? Oats are obviously a thickener in beer. And from what's been distilled from them, they tend to be a thickener. So is that playing into it? But again, all this stuff is kind of talk in the dark. So for me, with the, most of the time with the thesis, it's looking at receipts for grain and whatnot. But on the odd chance that I get to try this stuff, it's, again, I start randomly connecting dots that probably aren't there, thinking, oh, the 5% wheat was clearly, making that slight leafiness. But of course, this is largely my imagination. But anyway, it's worth knowing what these are to speculate about. Bow Street, the other fun thing about Bow Street, when we start looking under the kind of the carpets, and I think I brought this up yesterday, when Alfred Barnard visited Bow Street, he described the process. And unlike, say, Powers, where he says explicitly, or like Tullamore, where he says explicitly it's triple distilled, what he describes being done in Bow Street is not technically triple distilling. He says that they double distill and then they redistill the feints of the second distillation and mix the two. So it's almost like 2.5 times. Now, whether or not they had continued to do that by the 50s, I have no clue. It could have become straight triple distilled by then. But again, there were other ways of, it's not just mash bills, it's what people were doing. A lot of these were direct fired stills. There's any number of variables that make the past, a different country. But it is entrancing. The closest I can think of in contemporary IDL, oddly enough, would be Green Spot. That kind of sprier, lighter pot still. A bit, especially the old, like screw cappy Green Spots, where they were less vanillid and they were a bit more resinous. Weirdly enough, it reminds me. I got one nip. I don't know if Jarlath is on here, but the Ecklenville pot still that's maturing reminds me a little bit of that. Again, sprier, more pithy, kind of snap crackle. But again, as much nostalgia as a lot of us have for the heft of old pot still, Bow Street in particular, my love revolves around the sweetness, that's strange. And again, I use the term barley sugar, like I know what that means, but whatever it is, that strange, it's sweet in a way that I don't find in say, like a lot of what we call sweet now is sweet because it's been in certain fortified wine casks. It's not the same kind of sweetness. Of course, bourbon barrels only came in really after World War II in any sort of force. I found receipts for old barrels, and it's funny, we did have you know, we think of it as like sherry barrels and then bourbon barrels come in. But I was finding receipts for rum casks and all kinds of stuff knocking about, you know, whatever was being brought into the country in cask, you know, those casks could end up on the open market. So again, can be quite variable. Any closing thoughts on that, Barry, in retrospect?
This recipe had lasted until the... Yeah, I'm not sure if you can hear me all right, but I'm wondering if would this recipe have lasted all the way until the move to Middleton?
Okay, so
this has been right up to the 1973, or would it change before the move?
So this remains a huge, outstanding research question for me: is when and how did this dissolve? So in the most important, and I mentioned this yesterday, the single most important set of documents I found by accident. All the Locks distillery archives were donated to the state when Locks closed down. They're in the National Library manuscripts reading room. It's public access. I mean, there's nothing special about me getting to see it. It takes 5 minutes to get a membership. And it's an incredible resource. But within those Locks files are Locks copies of the Irish Pot Still Distillers Association memoranda. So it's actually the lot of them with files, you know, duplicated and passed around. And, you know, there was the 1951 Irish Whiskey Act, which was extremely vague. And in 1953, the IPDA draft responses to the government about this. And most of the IPDA files are just them complaining ad nauseum about the government, about, you know, export caps, etc. The Irish government really made life unnecessarily difficult for them. And that's part that doesn't often get said. You know, there was all this stuff about capping exports to preserve whiskey for the home market. And of course, this is nonsense. It's, you know, if you have enough to export, it means you're making more and so forth. But so a lot of them were kind of clipped at the knees, and they were quite annoyed about this. But they do say, you know, and this aligns with Locke's own practices, with publicity put out by them, that they're running about 15% oats, 5% wheat. And that idea of there being like 20% other stuff gels very, very much with the rest of the 20th century. It's really 20 to 30% adjuncts, or you say like 15 to 30 would be the spitting range. Up north, the other kind of big mash that appears is just straight malt, raw barley, and oats, and generally lower on the malt and higher on the oats. So like Cumber would have been about, say, 12% oats, double distilled. And this is running in tandem. I still don't know what Cork distillers were doing. So when we hear about this 5% adjuncts, that may have been Cork distillers all along, or something close to them. And it just switched from one to the other with Middleton, and the other two mash bills disappeared. Or Powers and Jameson may have lost adjuncts as things consolidated. My guess is that practice would have changed with the forming of IDL. It makes the most sense. When you have three distilleries, you start homogenizing what you're making, and that ends with the building of New Middleton. During the emergency years, wheat got rationed. So you do see wheat clipped. You had to get a permit to use wheat. So that could have had something to do with it. But again, without that last critical window is something still of a big mystery to me, is how did all of the diversity, obviously a lot of the diversity fell out just because the distilleries all closed down, but the ones that became Irish distillers, did they all magnetize to 5% and then nothing, or was that just Cork distillers practice, and then the other two closed, and then Middleton, you know, knocked it off? Whatever happened with the building of New Middleton in 1975, you know, the oats fell out. But the idea that, you know, this is some sort of natural evolution is not quite historically correct. You get the oats, the small oats filter mash, right back to the Victorian era, and they kind of existed hand in hand. So again, there's a lot of mystery still out there, you know, but the two big questions at the moment for me is why anyone bothered using 1% rye, and how did it end? So the 1953 was a very handy date, because it means that 7-year-old whiskey from the 60s, let alone 12-year-old whiskey, you know, is this mash, more or less, unless things changed the next year across the board, which they almost certainly didn't. And 1967 is the last year Jameson and Powers are pot still. So, where it basically closes that window. So if this mysterious 5% stuff existed, it almost certainly ended up in blends in the 70s, ironically enough. Because again, you're dealing with this kind of 7 to 12 year delay for anything that gets laid down. Should we crack on to the next one while we're on the subject of locks? So number 15, I think it's labeled as, with a little beigey label. That's the one. And you notice it's much darker. Locks, Irish whiskey has never had regions. And people have asked me about this before, but had there been, regions of a kind, I mean, Speyside boomed economically in Scotland because of the railway access, essentially, transport made available to the blending industry. The closest thing in Ireland would be the Midlands, now much smaller scale, but the canals created a kind of a new prosperous whiskey heartland. And so that's where Tullamore, Monasterevin, Locks, all these canal side distilleries, they ended up with a little kind of microclimate of distilling. And they'd have casks coming up from Dublin, casks whiskey going back down. There's some great oral history archives of interviews with old workers at the B. Daly distillery in Tullamore. And they talk about wheat coming up the canals to the distillery and whatnot. But again, had we had regions, you could think of, say, Dublin and Cork as pot still ground zero. Dublin made a lot of noise about it, but there was plenty of Cork pot still as well. And then the Midlands coming out from there. And then you have kind of rural Ulster was malt country, and then Belfast and the urban northeast as the column stills. But there was this weird phenomenon of essentially, the new middle class, the merchant middle class distillers in the Midlands, the Cassidys, the Locks, the Dalys. And they made some incredible product themselves. And they lasted, I mean, of the last 5 distilleries, 2 of them were from the middle of Offaly and Westmeath. So again, the canals were an important part of that. And when you smell Locks, by this point, so this is Locks closed in the 50s. It did have quite a close following. Favorite drink by legend of Fionnán O'Brien. So it had its own Powers sometimes try to claim him because there's that interview where he's holding the bottle of Powers. But it did have a following. There's a lot written about it in comparison to other rural distilleries. And then again, the files are all there. One of the oddest mysteries that popped up for me when researching it was they have 3 columns in the Locks accounts book and process book as well. Barley, oats, and then wheat/rye. And I've had a good few conversations because, we think of wheat and rye as polar opposites. In bourbon, they're treated as, wheated bourbon is the not rye, alternative pendulum swing. So why on earth would anyone treat them like they were interchangeable? And I've looked at some years where Locks were using rye almost exclusively. If you do the math to rye receipts to this column, it's all rye. Sometimes they circle it. They seem to drop off using rye around the 40s and 50s, the last years. Weirdly enough, they bought wheat from Tullamore Dew. Because DEW Limited had a lot of maltings and grain storage and whatnot. But they seem to have basically oscillated years based on availability of, is it 5% wheat? Is it 5% rye? Eventually falling out to wheat, and then they closed down. But so it's a mystery here. Is this a more or less identical mash to Jameson, or did the Jameson, as it said on its label, not have rye by then? Or does this have abnormally high amounts of rye? And by abnormally high, I mean, 6%. But give it a smell. obviously more spicy, more gingery. It's like an aspect of modern pot still in each of these is discernible, but isolated and put with other stuff that doesn't exist anymore. But when we talk about like resin and ginger and that side of it, this has it in spades. It has that crackle. The sherry content is obviously much deeper here. It's called Locks Liqueur whiskey, which again could mean anything. It just means old by their estimation. But obviously much heavier on the sherry than the Bow Street there. I see someone, Crahur Lavelle, is saying root ginger. Absolutely. It's that weird, again, it's ginger, but it's the one time as a child you make the mistake of biting into ginger, of encountering what ginger actually tastes like. We all did that. That wasn't just me, I hope. But anyway, it does have that weird mix of that kind of resin and ginger. For those who were here yesterday and had the B Daily tastes like resin as well, but it's a different kind of resin. There it's like tabletop, varnish resin, whereas here it's like plant resin. It's like root resin, bark kind of flavor. And again, wallops of ginger and just a thumbprint of sherry. The other thing is a lot of the sherry, and I know I brought this up yesterday, a lot of the sherry was a weird animal to begin with. So I had the privilege once of looking through Mitchell & Sons books. And again, hate to repeat from yesterday, but one of the things that really stood out to me was that Irish sherry was already a kind of a Frankenstein, where they'd bring in sherry and said, we're used to dealing with like Oloroso or PX or whatever. What they were doing was they were getting in sherry and saying, oh, this Fionnán's a bit dry. Let's knock in a bit of Oloroso, whatever. Sometimes they were knocking in port into dry sherry to sweeten it up. So each of these casks would already have been kind of a wonky. So when people talk about yellow spot, the advertising at the time said, oh, we found records of Malaga casks. And people started taking all this stuff very seriously and saying, oh, the yellow spot was a Malaga finish or a Malaga portion. And actually, no, when you look at those records, it's just Malaga being knocked into other stuff. Really, the truth is that these were odd concoction drinks to begin with. These fortified wine kind of approximations to palate. There's a lot of really cool history in general about wine blending as a trade, where people thought they were getting French wine and they were actually getting like a third Spanish wine that was tipped in to kind of correct to whatever they thought the client wanted. Again, we're so used to dealing with reliable building blocks that we forget how slapdash a lot of this stuff was and how it had to be accounted for backwards. So again, a lot of that, even what we call cream sherry, this stuff is usually Oloroso and PX mixed together, but that's a very like cut and dry version. But a lot of this would have been strange. And some of the stuff is really, really deep in terms of fingerprints. But here, there's almost a weird, it's not licorice. It's like the crap bassets, the one that, every child eats last. The strange, it is licorice, but it's not strong licorice, but it's not sweet. It's the kind of like pale licorice, but it's in there, but again, always with that sherry, and a lot of the wine was drier or sweeter rather in general. People liked sweet wine. It's only with the 20th century that places that don't make wine had reliable access to very, very good dry wine. So a lot of people drank sweet wine just by, default, because it was a safety mechanism as anything. And of course, fortified wine traveled very well. But tastes have dried over the years. There's some very interesting stuff about the Irish merchant class in Bordeaux and how they were essentially catering for people who were drinking port. And there's a whole academic thesis out there on the adjustment of French wine outside of France and then the importation of the concept backwards, and how a lot of these British claret drinkers were wooed away from port to begin with, and they kind of demanded a certain kind of Bordeaux, and then it was, reinvented to suit their taste. And you had this whole network, bizarrely enough, largely Cork merchants facilitating this. So again, there's a rich history of wine that doesn't taste like the wine we know. So when you get that kind of like muskier side of the sherry, I don't know if that's just to do with the kind of cask they were mixing together, or if that's the kind of sherry people were drinking. We rarely get to drink. That's the second glass of Locks I've ever had in my life. We rarely get to drink it. You know, it doesn't pop up as much as the others. But again, when we try these side by side, we forget, you know, Middleton did its best, New Middleton did its best to replicate as many styles of distilling as possible. And, you know, even beyond the like trad pot to light pot, I mean, the whole setup, as anyone who's spent 5 minutes talking to them about the setup is, you know, it's terrifying. But it's still, you know, what was grabbed out of the burning building, you know, the house is on fire and what furniture was brought out. And when you try the silent distilleries, you remember how rich and diverse Irish distilling actually was internally. Now, of course, we're leaving out all the dregs, the unpleasant stuff, which did exist, you know, and we should be honest about that. I'll leave that one to come back to because I don't want to take too long with each of these. So cracking on to number 14, I think on the paneling, which is Paddy 1960s. So some of us last well, there's a question about examples of rock cut. We'll get to that. We're drinking one mystery Bonders whiskey today that I apologize in advance if it turns out to be rock cut, but we won't know until we get to it. But this is much more reliable. So number 14, Paddy 1960s. So we had Dungorney 1930 yesterday, which is old Cork Distillers pot still. And I went on about how Cork Distillers used to be a much sweeter style of pot still, which it was, you know, but a different kind of sweetness. When I say sweet, not in the sense that Bow Street was like clementine sweet. I mean, not as gingery, really. It was kind of clovery and creamy. If you ever see Powers and Jemison before 1968, 1968 is the break-off year for Irish whiskey in general. 1966, IDL comes together. 1968, they hire Kevin McCourt, an external CEO, who was not attached to whiskey as a kind of an impartial figure. And he says, right, switch to blends, start consolidation, cut off Bonders relationships, and let's take on blended Scotch. And he was correct, really, in retrospect. But that's the year that all this stuff changes. Paddy, however, had already been a blend. It kind of alternates depending on which Paddy you get. But Middleton had a column still. They had a column still by the time Alfred, people forget this. They had a column still by the time Alfred Barnard got there. It was quite rare in Cork. The Cork Distillers Company was quite technically minded. And of course, Cork Distillers was already an amalgamation before IDL even happened. By the time we're talking about, they had replaced that column still with a Hamburg, with a German still, but they still were making product for mixing and for singling, as it were. But anyway, so this is young Cork Distillers, but also with Cork Distillers columns. I've still not found what Cork Distillers were using in their columns. I assume it was maize or some combination of maize malt. And again, a lot of the Ulster columns use rye. Rye was also, there was a third-party industry of collecting yeast from spent goo, essentially from column distillation. And Cork Distillers did have something called terrier yeast. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if they were pulling the same trick and putting in about a quart of rye. Now, of course, it's refined. It's not as noticeable as if rye appears in a pot still. But, you know, all that has been, people don't get as weepy about the diversity of Irish column still bases as we do about pot still. But they were actually, again, diverse enough and in ways that are quite alien, more alien to what we call grain whiskey in Ireland now than what we call pot still. But give it a smell. And again, I don't know, Paddy is one. Yeah, someone's bringing up Paddy 10. So Paddy 10, there's the Italian export Paddy 10s, which do say pure pot still. So some of the Cork Distillers product was pot still, but the Paddy's core product had become a blend. The Paddy brand has been snatched from the jowls of death by Sazerac recently. My heart always goes out to Paddy. You know, I think of the three founding companies, it was the most neglected. I mean, some of the Paddy stuff from the 80s is pretty grim. It was kind of left by the wayside. In my humble opinion, the standard really went down. And it's sad that, you know, the one brand that was actually made in Middleton, you know, you go to Middleton, you learn all about John Jemison, who never set foot in the place. And the Cork brand is swept aside. Now Middleton don't even own it. So I hope Sazerac do something with it, because it is deserving. It was, you know, the Beamish of whiskey. It was the Cork, you know, alternative to some of the Dublin stuff. And again, the legacy of Cork distilling, and I know I mentioned this yesterday, you know, I had a very bizarre chat with Barry Crockett right before he retired, when Barry Crockett Legacy came out, and he was talking about the Cork style of pot still. And, you know, these you know, might as well be talking about the, you know, the moons of Jupiter, for all I could distinguish what that might mean to him. And he was talking about those sweeter, more kind of melon forward notes that turn up in Barry Crockett Legacy. And when I started getting nips of young Cork distilleries, you start seeing that weird, you know, pot still can be melony, it can be juicy. It's sweet, but it's sweet in a plush kind of sense, you know. Now this is blended down, obviously, but again, you get a bit of the dry clover from the Dungurn we had yesterday. Obviously not the wallop of 30 years of bourbon barrel creams, and it has been blended down. Give it a taste. My God, the nose is not, to me, all that active, especially if you compare it to the pot still that was coming out of CDC. But on the palate, you really get a wallop of Cork, you know. And again, we don't know what the blended ratio was. Old blends used to have a lot more pot still in them. Even the Middleton blends, you know, they've fallen down. I mean, during the 1908 negotiations, you know, we portray ourselves as the heroes of the whole story of, you know, we rejected the column still and, you know, fought to the bitter end. And actually, A, that's not true. Again, Middleton had a column still. And B, there were a lot of disgruntled Scots who moaned well into the 1930s about the blend bringing the death of real Scotch distilling. And you've got people like Colonel Grant up at Glenlivet who were right up, and again, the same kind of like patrician background as the Jemisons, who saw this as some sort of defilement. But one of the negotiations that goes on between Andy Walker and so Johnny Walker's son and a lot of the Highland and Speyside distillers is he says, you know, the blends will all be 50-50. Don't worry about it. And of course, now they're nothing of the kind. But blends further back tend to have more. Oh, now, of course, there's plenty of like shocking blends from the 1800s that had like 5% pot still. So I don't want to give any romantic ideas, but they're like establishment blends of the 1950s, you know, after blended whiskey had really trounced the world. And especially in Ireland, when that happens in the 70s, they tend to be heavier on the pot still side, although they are possibly just from sheer reluctance. But whatever the case may be, it does taste an awful lot like, if I was to be given that blind, I'd like, you know, knowing in advance it was CDC, I would certainly think it had the feel of the Cork distillers pot still. Again, their pot still was already a bit lighter anyway, but that certainly has that, again, that clover, slightly more melony, you know, plush fruit, as opposed to, again, like dry pithy clementine of Bow Street, or that, again, like root ginger of the Locks, or just oil and leather of Powers. So again, I'd be very curious to know, A, what was in those columns to begin with, and B, what was in the, you know, what was the ratio between column and pot. And as I know I said yesterday, I have a pet theory about Bushmills columns. When Bushmills had columns before they were part of IDL, they had gutted out the old Coleraine distillery in Ulster, which used to be a malt distillery, and they were still making malt there, but they also put in columns. And unless I hear differently, they seem to have been running them on their own resources, which would mean grain, barley-based column still whiskey, there is a chance that Cork distillers were making a barley-based product, similarly just funneling in resources from the pot stills, or they could have been imitating establishment column distillers like the ones we saw in Belfast, who were using maize and rye. And it's funny, people raise, and I get asked about this all the time as well, people raise an eyebrow now about Irish distillers using bucket loads of French maize. In truth, we've been using maize and imported grain since virtually the birth of the column still industry. When you look at column stills come on tap in the 1830s and really come into force 1850s onwards. And it's around the same time in 1846, the British government repealed something called the Corn Laws, which were prohibitive tariffs on grain coming into the UK from abroad at cheaper rates. And they're knocked off, oddly enough, because of the Irish famine. Robert Peel petitions for them to be dropped so that grain can come in. Now, by the time that happens, it's kind of too little too late. But it means, oddly enough, for whiskey, that you get shed loads of cheap grain, which really means American maize, coming into places like Belfast Dock and so forth, at the same time that you have a column still industry that is capable of plowing through this stuff like water for the first time in history. And so if you look at old Dunville's records and whatnot, they all say they're running on maize. And weirdly enough, rye. Rye has been grown in Ireland since the Middle Ages, as I think I also mentioned yesterday. The Irish for rye is Shigal, and you still find, places with, what's the one in Sligo? Cap and Teagle or whatever. But if you do the grammar, it breaks down to a field of rye. It seems to have been grown largely as a cover crop. Rye thrives in cold, dry places. So again, Central Europe, Canada, places like that. It's not great in Ireland because we're cold but not dry. But it seems to have been used as a restorative crop. It was also grown. There's a weird tillage concept called maslin, where people would grow wheat and rye sown together in a field. And wheat needs very good conditions to grow, and the rye was kind of an insurance policy. So you have a lot of maslin bread from like historical recreations now, where they were inseparable. And I have found from the 1700s records of people distilling maslin. So, again, even when we talk about mash bill components, they can be a bit more blurred. There was a similar thing with barley and oats called dredge, but not nearly as necessary because, both of those grow pretty resiliently. And oats really, you can grow oats in miserable conditions. But speaking of Dunvilles, we'll crack on to what's labeled as number 16, Dunvilles. So this will be my first time ever having Dunvilles. I'm enormously excited about this. Now, Dunvilles. Is Jarlath on here? Does he get Jarlath in? We'll give give that a bit of it. Oh, and the other thing, while we're on maize, because there was a question about maize. So I tend to use the word maize, and I think increasingly people are using it. Corn is an odd word historically. So corn actually, for the vast majority of the history of the English language, corn means grain, full stop. Something with a kernel. So when Shakespeare talks about corn, he's not talking about corn on the cob. And in industrial history in Ireland, when Alfred Barnard talks about corn lofts, or when we have corn market on Thomas Street, these were about grains, and they're usually about, the most common in Ireland reference would be oats, but it tends to be the most common grain grown, so again, it can be quite misleading when people talk about what was at the time called Indian corn, or slightly later American corn, which then comes over via American English and becomes corn here. But if you see references to corn, that is not necessarily maize. Hello, Gareth.
Fionnán O'Connor, how are you?
Grand.
I might not get a word in edgeways here, but I'm going to try.
The moment of revelation was done. Was really all that great.
I have never been so nervous in my whole life.
Dunvilles. So going back to the history momentarily. again, this broad story we can tell in Ireland about Ireland rejecting Colin Still is not actually true. And I know a lot of you already know that. But what is true is that the Colin Still Ireland relationship to the Colin Still was a huge part of what made the whole industry collapse. Colin distilling did take off in Ireland, and in a huge way. And what a lot of people don't realize is by the turn of the century, by the 1890s even, there was more column still whiskey coming out of Ireland than there was pot still, full stop. There was enormous amounts. You know, Belfast in particular made column still whiskey. You know, they were doing it like they built ships. It was heavy industry with cutting edge technology. You look into places like, you know, Connswater, they were electrified. They were very, very proud when Barnard came there of having the latest equipment. You know, it was a very different kind of Victorian era, whereas a lot of the kind of, you know, the Jamesons of the world represented, a patrician Victorian sensibility, the kind of gentleman proprietors. And then you had rural distilleries like Locks or Cumber who saw themselves as the, you know, peers of that cohort. But Belfast was heavy industry, Avonale, Connswater, these places were machines. And what didn't happen in Ireland that did happen in Scotland was cooperation between pot still producers and column still producers. If we're to talk about what facilitated the demise, probably of both. In Scotland, you got eventually a lot of malt producers talked around to the idea, again, on promises of, you know, I mean, you look at the way Scotch whiskey is set up now. I mean, it's no longer 90%, but, you know, up until recently, the breakdown was 90% column, 10% malt. And the column still base subsidizes the whole malt industry. And I know malt is doing much, you know, phenomenally well now, but even so, the whole thing has been historically kept alive by blenders. And again, Walker was very clear in the lead up to the 1908 commission. He said, you know, I'm not your enemy. I'm your number one client. If you can be a component of my blend, that's more money in a month than your little, you know, crofting village out in the Isle of Skye is going to, you know, give you in a lifetime. And he was correct. And what didn't, again, Dublin was so paranoid about blending, saw it as discreet fraud done behind closed doors. And there was a lot of fraud going on. There was shed loads of cheap spirit being sent back and forth between Glasgow and Belfast for custom stamps. There was a lot of stuff that was under the age of 3 months and being dyed and doctored and whatnot. And I think what happened in Scotland was a few enlightened individuals, not a few, quite a number of enlightened individuals realized that this same idea of blending could give birth to consistency that malt and pot still were not capable of providing. And that's the story of the 20th century, is the march toward brands, towards, you know, you can have a Johnny Walker in Shanghai or New York, it's still going to be a Johnny Walker. And when those brands got big enough, all this back the doors fraud, it ceased to be as relevant, because just the sheer amount of scale you need to operate on to create a big brand negates that kind of, you know, petty side corner dealing. And in a far more beautiful world, Dublin and Belfast would have cooperated, or column distilling and pot still distilling would have cooperated, and we've gotten something similar. What you do see, what makes Dunville's almost unique, and again, Cork Distillers kind of, but Dunville's were running pots and columns and blending on site in a way almost anticipatory of Middleton, what they do today, and creating their own products, you know, and creating that kind of unit that would, you know, facilitate stocks while they could still sell, you know, to clients. They were blending in even before they got column stills. When Alfred Barnard came, they didn't have column stills, but the math doesn't make the slightest bit of sense. They're making 1.5 million gallons out of 3 pots. They were very clearly buying from Connswater or Avonale or somebody, and then they installed columns to start making it themselves. So again, almost in another lifetime, indicative of what might have kept Irish distilling alive. The Dunvilles themselves were, unlike, say, Avonale. Avonale seems to have been quite a sketchy operation. You know, they wouldn't let Alfred Barnard in past the front door, versus Connswater columns in Belfast, who were very proud to show, you know, yeah, we thump out grain whiskey like there's no tomorrow. We have contracts ready to go, blah, blah, blah. Dunville's was almost like something between that industrial Belfast column still industry and the kind of Dublin gentleman proprietors idea. They were quite well off, but the idea that they would put in their prestige category to win awards. So again, could have been a very different fate. Dunville's is a really sad story. You know, unlike many distilleries, they were actually turning a profit throughout the early 1900s. In the 1920s, you know, and one of the other great mysteries was, why did Irish pot still outsurvive its column still confreres? You know, why did Locks outsurvive Connswater? Why did that fall apart? And part of that is to do with industrial history. So one of the more notable aspects is DCL, so Distillers Company Limited, which is the ancestor company to Diageo. It was an absolute force, and it was run by a guy named William Ross in the early 20th century. And Ross, more than any one individual, built the mechanism of blended Scotch and how Scotch operates. And he understood how dangerous column distilling was if in the wrong hands. Again, trying to shut down fraud, both liquid fraud and financial fraud, of which there was plenty. And he seems to have just gone around Scotland buying places and closing them for the funds, trying to consolidate into a few key partners. And the other aspect of that was, you know, shutting down Irish, what could be a competitive threat. And he bought a company called United Distilleries Company, UDC, which was an Ulster column still powerhouse. It was Watts, Connswater, Avonale put together. They made 6 million gallons a year of column still juice and another million on top of that of pot still juice. And he basically took them on as a going concern and then shut them down. There's an infamous board meeting in 1933 where he says Ireland is an irrelevance. And one of the saddest parts of Dunville's is when they approach DCL looking for the takeover, and DCL aren't even bothered. They say, no, we're, you know, it's not worth our time. There's no future in this. And then Dunville's voluntarily, despite the fact they were actually turning a profit, wind up the company in 1936. And it takes about 12 years to get rid of all the stuff. So it's, you know, it's funny, history is written by the victors, but the elegy is written by the most vocal losers, you know, and that's the pot still crowd. But there is an entirely different history there, and really something that was always part of the same history. And Dunville's is such an important part of that. You know, it's the Irish industry that could have been, had we been smarter about it and more cooperative. So give it a smell. And you smell it, it is a blend, but obviously, and we know that just because it's, you know, it's dead certain, but there is a high pot still content in it. Again, sometimes you see Dunville's broken down as malt, pot still, column. I think that's modern sensibilities. I've never seen a record of them actually genuinely making malt. They may have. I assume they were buying malt in from Coleraine in places when they needed it. But even so, it smells, it's that kind of musty, dusty, you know, again, we were talking about cat piss yesterday, that weird yeast forward smell, almost, you know, almost reminiscent of sometimes hops can have that infamous cat piss, but still recognizably Irish, still recognizably, you know, and it's odd because there's no pot still blends to compare it to other than Cork Distillers, really. But it has that kind of older heft. What do you think of that, Jarlath?
Yeah, Fionnán, this is my third time trying this. We tried it last year at a distillery event that went down very well, and I've had it in the house since. This is actually the last 2 bottles that I've had of this, so I have no more left. This was my last 2 bottles went into this. Yeah, I mean, it's my guess is that the grain content was coming from Watts and Derry. I would agree that it's quite possibly written malt from Coleraine. That would make sense. I'm guessing the grain is definitely from the northwest as well. Dunville's were pot stilled. You know, they were barley and mixed grains. What I like about it is I love the cask mix in it. We're going back to 1930s here, so we're probably talking sort of 50% sherry, 50% port, or maybe not far away. And I love the way, for me, what I put out of this whiskey is just how that port cask comes in at the finish. And it finishes a lot heavier than it starts. Whereas at the start, on the palate and on the nose, it is quite bland. It's quite grain driven. But I love the way that heavier pot still element of it, and certainly those sherry and probably more so the port cask come through at the end for me, and you're just left with that lovely, old musty port cask note, which is probably my favorite element of it.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I'm not even entirely sure there was malt in it. I've never seen verifiable proof. It would make sense that they made one product in pots and one in columns and brought in adjuncts as needed. Unfortunately, the Dunville's records are in the Public Records of Office of Northern Ireland, but they're not the production records. They're the board meetings. Yeah. So they're exactly the wrong records for me. It's all finance. It's all just how well we're doing in the year, which is interesting, but not production. I don't think the word whiskey gets used once in the records that are still preserved.
Yeah, and certainly and even in Alfred Bernard's time, there's very little detail as to what the mash bill is. It talks about the sprinkler system and the ingenious techniques, etc., etc. The 60,000 litre 6,000 litre stills, but it doesn't refer to mash bills. So we are a wee bit, unfortunately, we're still a bit blind as to exactly what grains we're getting in there. Do you know?
Yeah,
and the fact that it's a blend doesn't help us to. The fact that it's a blend doesn't help us to decipher that going back and tasting it.
Absolutely. I mean, the closest I've found was reference to maize coming in for the columns, with big whoop, but nothing of any sort of detail. We do know from the 1908 commission, so the Waterside distillery in Derry, so the pot still side of the Watts operation, which was really more of a column still producer, they had about 4% oats, about 38% malt, and the rest raw barley. So a kind of a less intensive cumber. And we see that mash, I remember, the cumber mash we did find, I remember, you guys are making it. So there is the possibility between, again, there's scant materials, but if those two are the Ulster mashes that come, and they are very different to what's happening in Dublin, that could be indicative of an Ulster style, or it could just be sheer chance. We don't have the materials to show. For me, this tastes like the paddy grown up and, started working for a living. And it's that same, it is that, again, pot still blend, but it has the length that the other doesn't have. It has a beef tea element. I was reading, there's a great book, guy J.P. McMahon, he's a chef, and I'm a terrible cook, but he put out something called the Irish Cookbook, but half of it's food history. So I bought it for that stuff about, when did people eat seals and whatnot. But there's all these dead recipes in there. There's one for scaltine where it was, beef broth, eggs, and whiskey. And you think, my God, who the hell woke up in the morning and said, this is breakfast? The three of them stirred into a cup and knocked back at 5 a.m. But there's a weird, when I think of like broth and whiskey mixed together, there's something of that in here, that's strange.
Tomorrow morning, Fionnán, tomorrow morning. We might just try that.
There's a kind of the carpet musk gets so hefty, it feels like, beef tea. It's still blended, but again, it's clearly a high pot still content blend. And it operates in a similar logic to the paddy, but again, just so much more length. So
I also guess, Fionnán, there is someone here that has to take into account also, the distillery stopped distill in 1935, 1936.
Yeah.
They had lots of stock in the warehousing, so the warehousing were bottling right through till the 50s. So some of the stuff might be in the cask for longer than it was initially intended. Some of the stuff might be in the cask for longer than say, the Three Crowns in the 1910s or 1920s was. And that's another sort of historical inaccuracy that we really have to consider here. Does some of that mustiness come from possibly the...
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you look at, say, like early New Middleton distillery, the 80s stock is, infamously dusty because the casks are just, in poor condition. They're fifth fill barrels in some cases, inert, dusty, whatever. Nobody seems to really peg down some of the stuff that they're too long, whatever the case may be. It took a long time to get rid of. One of the great mysteries is what the hell DCL did with all this Ulster stock when they shut the places. I've heard it argued quite passionately that it probably ended up in blended Scotch. William Ross was an austere, brilliant capitalist. There's no way in hell he just threw the stuff into Belfast Lock. It's
quite possible it's on Willie Jack's house.
They wouldn't have dumped it into the sea. There's also the chance that some of it was sold locally. You see a lot of stuff pop around in the north that has age statements of like 16 and whatnot. There probably was a lot of older juice. People just didn't know. Oh, sorry, I'm not supposed to say juice anymore. I think there was some discussion on Facebook. Older syrup popping around Belfast. Probably tasted a bit like syrup at that point. But it is, and it's like you said, Charlotte. I've always I was terrified of being let down by Dunvilles. Getting a crack at it and think, oh, Jesus, because there's so much propaganda from Dublin saying, all this stuff is now they're really not gunning for Dunvilles per se. They're gunning for Avonneal and Connswater and the bespoke calling for blending purposes crowd. And by all accounts, there was a lot, there was a lot for them to be annoyed about. But even as you mentioned, port receipts from the era, port was far more popular than sherry for starters. There was a lot more port coming into Ireland. You had port coming in, you had sherry, obviously. Again, I was finding odd receipts for port-headed casks where they would take like rum casks, stuff they genuinely probably didn't think was as good, and putting port heads on it. So there was an understanding that this stuff did stuff. It wasn't just, what casks are available by that stage. Now, sometimes people could be sketchy about it, but you do see people singling out one or the other. And the other thing that came out yesterday was chestnut casks, which I know have been romanticized retrospectively as something cool, but actually they were just the cheapest chips. If you want to fork out for a port cask, we'll give you port in a chestnut cask.
Yeah, my take on that has always been with the port has always been, that my take is that possibly the sherry was a lot drier. It was a lot of dry sherry was being used back in the sort of early 1900s, and maybe the port was always a sweeter, more substantial influence on the whiskey.
Well, to be honest, they were knocking a lot of port into sherry. So what they'd get is, you see references to sherry coming in, and the likes of even Mitchell's high-end wine proprietors saying this is too dry, dump, X amount of port into that, see if we can sweeten it up, whatever. All of these casks, half the time they weren't port or sherry or Malaga or whatever. They were concoctions made to suit clientele because they were inconsistent base materials kind of jiggered before resale. So again, a lot of this stuff is more of a hit and run job in general than we think. The idea of X type of wine or Y type of wine, varietals in general, being as honest about being those things as we assume today is not historically tuned. But it's funny, there is, and I agree with you on the use of old or casks that are quite old, because some of the smells there I don't associate with whiskey from the pre-70s. I don't associate with, like, we started with a Bow Streeter. I don't associate with a lot of that stuff. I associate it with like Jameson 12 in the 80s, these syrupy, dark, musky, smelling vaguely like carpet Irish whiskeys. And a lot of us, think of that as like older Irish whiskey, but then you get further back behind the 70s and that's not it at all. And so again, a lot of that is whatever about old casks, or too much time in casks, or heftier wood, whatever it may be, and that smells to me like the paddy, but a bit heftier at birth and left in that kind of cask. rather than, you know, again, that was paddy just a normal cask.
Yeah, I mean, I've had the fortune or misfortune to sample a lot of Scotch from, you know, maybe not the better distilleries and fourth, fifth, and sixth fill crafts, and that's a different flavour from what I'm getting in this Dunville. But maybe that's the differential between spent bourbon crafts and maybe older port and sherry crafts. You know, we don't know because we've nothing to compare it to currently. You know, that's the problem. You know, we can compare this to something that's spent too long on spent bourbon crafts, but we can't. You know, spent port crafts is sort of harder to compare to. And I'm not too sure it is a spent craft. I just think it's that maybe something that was in. So maybe a slight difference in the port or sherry back then. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. But also, and again, like a lot of it was the doctorate at birth. And then again, you had a lot of casks, and I know, again, I brought this up with Powers, a lot of casks that were essentially made by the distillery, used as seemingly virgin casks by the distillery, and then recycled back into the system as essentially seasoned with itself. And that goes on for a few cycles. So you get these, like, you know, the Powers seasoned casks. So there's a lot more diversity in wood, and some of it's just purely practical, you know. But the idea of people having, you know, I think when we talk about cask policies now, the past is much richer than we think it is, but it's also not as romantic all the time. So we should be, you know, interested but cognizant of all of these different factors, none of which are airtight, you know, purely for the flavor. You know, there's always some hand on the shoulder of pure pragmatism. And of course, what's available, you know. I'm nursing back at that locks now. I finished the Dunvilles. But it's strange, you know, again, tremendous diversity. And I think something that we have.
Fionnán, I'm going to sign off here. Before I do sign off, I'm going to cry now because they were my last two bottles. But I think, you know, before we go, we'll have to sort of say hats off to Paul and hats off to Belfast Whisky Club. You know, over yesterday and today we opened 12 bottles of whiskey that I'm not, you know, I was there when we were bottling these down in Actonville, and to open these 12 bottles inside 2 weeks, you know, was just nuts. You know, some of these bottles others might not have ever opened, you know, so to get these opened out in the wild and get so many people tasting them, 20 odd in every tasting, you know, this is something that we'll never experience for a long time again. You know, sitting over one day and tasting these 6 for 2 days and tasting the 12, you know, the old Powers, done Journey from yesterday, the Gilby's 10-year-old from the 70s, you know, all these whiskies, you know, that I haven't tasted before, some of them, you know, you know, I think we should all open more bottles and track left, you know, and maybe that's what's happened in the last 2 days. So I just want to give hats off to Paul and the Belfast Whisky Club for doing that, because, you know, if you learn the 12 whiskies over the last 2 days, it's just been nothing short of madness, you know. So yeah, fair play. And Fionnán, you have been as interesting as always, maybe not as controversial as yesterday, but yeah, we'll enjoy the crack. And here, I'm going to sign off now and let us enjoy these last 2 whiskies. Fionnán, talk to you soon.
Take care, Charlie.
Cheers.
Anyone want to jump in there? I think Brendan's gone off somewhere. Going once, going twice. I think. Okay. Anyway, it'll just be me. So until somebody wants to step forward, you're welcome at any time, anyone. Grant, okay, so those are the kind of the next 2 we're going to talk about are kind of mystery bottles. So we've got, even just today, we've got, there's a question about port pipes. Yes, and again, the idea now, Ireland had a huge huge thirst for port. First of all, Ireland has a huge wine importing tradition. A lot of that is tied up with claret, but also with sherry import. Port was, first of all, if we're to talk honestly, you know, port and Britain have a very, very old history together. I think the longest running treaty in Europe is the Methuen Treaty, which was that Portugal gets first rights to exported British wool, and Britain gets first rights to exported Portuguese port. It's why anytime we have port now over here, the names don't sound remotely Portuguese. They all have names, you know, like Sandeman and whatnot, because they're all the names of middlemen. And you go over to these port houses and as many of you know, my other half is Portuguese, and her mother works for the Board of Agriculture out there. And port is a terribly set up system. It's essentially a cartel where farmers in the Douro Valley are required to sell the majority of their crop to the existing port houses. You can't set up a small port brand and then grow and develop yourself. It's a real shame. I think the IWS are having a port tasting at some point when we get actual tastings back online, and Helena's mum got some port just off of farms, backdoor stuff. So it should be fun. But again, the British Empire has had a deep relationship with port, sometimes verging on the brink of bullying. But the flip side of that is, Napoleon burnt Douro to the ground, or tried to spite Wellington. So we've had this deep, back and forth with port. Samuel Johnson infamously said, what was it? Claret is for boys, port is for men, and brandy is for heroes. But there was a deep, and if you look back at just drinking records among the aristocracy in Ireland, they were knocking back port punches with whiskey long before we were talking seriously about aging whiskey at all. So whiskey and port go back way further than I was aware of before I started looking at this stuff. Are you messing around with any port, Brendan?
We actually are. I'm going to be jumping on the tasting now in about half an hour. Yeah, we're doing a little port tasting in there as well. We just so happened to be, we needed to put some of our old stock into a cask, and our good friends in Neffin gave us a lovely cask. It happened to be a port cask. I said, what have you got ready? Port, ship it over. Neffin Cooperage, and we threw some County Antrim single malt in there, 12-year-old. So yeah. Just simply because we had to put somewhere to put it. Yeah,
well, it's a proven formula, that one. There's a certain bottling comes to mind. So I suppose the next one will be number 7. So this is when we start talking about mysteries. So this is Club. So it's McKibben's Club. The bottle says Club. So this is a huge mystery. McKibben's, right? McKibben's was a Belfast blender. So if you look back, the kind of truths about whiskey era, Dublin was enormously paranoid about calling distilling, yes, but Belfast docks in particular. And they have an awful right to be paranoid. There was a lot of crap going around, but a lot of it wasn't even made in Belfast for starters. It was shipped into Belfast for a customs stamp and then shipped right back out. Now, at the same time, you did have column still distillers and even just third-party industries that were more than happy to facilitate that. And then you had a lot of column still whiskey that wasn't sold as whiskey at all. And we forget this, an enormous amount of column still output from Ireland. We talk about whiskey exports in Ireland. Actually, a lot of that went to rectifiers in England, became gin. So, there's any number of things that come up. A huge part of the column still industry in Scotland was subsidized by the Methylated Spirits Act, which said, if you methylate the stuff, you don't have to pay excise. So they were, creating like medicinal alcohol as well. And then some of that was leaking into blenders and whatnot. But anyway, blending in the sense of like Andrew Usher, Johnny Walker, etc., took off in Scotland. That industry, blenders not born from a distilling concern, making it big, didn't really happen. We had Bonder's brands, but you see a few of them trying to do that, and they're largely in East Ulster. And McKibben's were a blender from the 1870s. I have no idea what's in this. This is, obviously decades after United Distillers was shut down by DCL, decades after Dunville's was shut down. This could be Dunville's. This could be Connswater Column Still. This could be Scotch. It's really not clear what the hell is in these bottlings. Now, if you look at the McKibbens themselves, so it's called McKibben's Club Whiskey, and you see some of it knocking about as a 16-year-old, which probably means they bought up somebody's old stock. Could well have been Dunville's. Give it a smell. It could also, in a very real sense, be Scotch. Colonel Alan McKibben was the MP for East Belfast, So again, a bit more well-to-do than a lot of the, although, you know, you had industrialists becoming influential public figures as well. But he was a representative for Hague at one point, which was DCL. So again, it's an absolute mystery what this, now DCL also shut down all the old Ulster columns and absorbed that stock, and they could have resold it to him. Maybe it didn't end up in blended Scotch, or not all of it did. It says Irish whiskey, so it could well be his connections in DCL giving him stuff that they closed down, which would be mostly Connswater at that point. But give it a taste. It does not taste like pot still whiskey. That is either a very light blend or it's the grain whiskey of its era, maybe aged for a while. Remember, the grain whiskey was not as pure at the time as it is now. And again, proper Ulster grain whiskey. Again, Connswater, thankfully, we have records of through Kirker and Greer, who were the blenders who also bankrolled Connswater Distillery. And again, grain content oscillates quite a bit, but roughly about a quarter malt, a quarter rye, and half maize. So weirdly enough, a kind of a bourbony drink, kind of. But for me,
there's a bit of smoke in there as well.
Yeah, it could, and it could be a number of things. It could be Scotch vatted into it. It could just be blended Scotch from the era. That should never be tossed aside. It could be just Hague, and lying about being Irish whiskey. You know, it's odd. You get that smell again, the cat piss smell from using dry bags of yeast that you get from old distilleries in general. And again, it can be quite an entrancing smell. But for me, there is a bit of that. You know, like we had the Bushmills 9 yesterday. Now, the Bushmills 9 was very clearly either a vatted malt or a vatted malt with a bit of Avenil that had been bought on the side, tipped in. Probably too young for the Coleraine columns to have kicked off. Although, again, it could have been young Coleraine spirit, as long as it was at least 9. Whatever it is not Irish pot still, and it's not Dunville's. Or I'd be amazed if it was Dunville's. Now, Dunville's was where I was leaning toward, just information wise. But it could just be old. Again, Alan McKibben had close links with DCL people, but he was also, I don't know if he overlapped with, you know, James Craig was part of the Dunville's family when he was in Parliament, but I think he would have been slightly before McKibben. But anyway, however McKibben was getting this liquid, you know, club whiskey, again, gentlemanly overtones, etc. But a lot of these terms get thrown around really, really loosely. It could also be DCL stuff already vatted with some Irish stock, and then they were allowed to legally call it Irish because of half the contents or something. You know, there's so much under the table blending going on, or blending and resale. But it's indicative of what went wrong in Irish blending, what didn't happen successfully. You know, in this, what could have happened, the birth of blending, hand in hand with the industrial scale of column distillation, led whiskey as a whole into the 20th century, into the era of big blends and standardization and brands. And, you know, pot still, and it's the Dublin obsession with provenance, with where did this come from? He was never going to fly with that. And you look at like Dunville's, yes, they put a better show for blends than most, but they weren't the kind of blenders that, say, like the Walkers were, or even Usher, you know, getting from multiple sources, or Tommy Dewar, or any of these guys in Scotland who were canny industrialists who realized that multiple sources could create consistency. This stuff, I mean, what do you think of the taste, Brendan?
It's funny that you were talking about port. Is that why you were talking? You nearly get a bit out of it. But it tastes like a good enough quality blend, to be honest. It's funny you were saying about blended whiskey back then used to be less clean than it is now, which is good, to be honest, because blends we get now are probably too much like aged vodka, and that's the problem. I don't mind a bit of those congeners coming through in a blend, and you can definitely get those in there. But actually, you just can't tell what's what. Can't tell what's what.
And again, like, there's parts of it that I would find actively unpleasant. There's still that sharp, and it's not the charming sharp, the kind of resinous sharp that you get off the likes of Lock. There's something that feels like it's a little unclean. That is, now of course it is refined coming off columns, but whether that be the cast or what have you, it feels like bad porn.
Yeah.
You know
what? I've got a bottle here somewhere that recently. It's kind of, I know this is better, but you get some of those notes out of it, you know that?
Yeah.
For the 12-year-old, those dry notes, as if it's coming from like dry yeast, sort of like you're getting that out and mixed with like.
You haven't had that wonderful kind of like out of the
water. I think there's a bit of that note in there. It just so happened I was drinking. Maybe because I was drinking it recently, I don't know, but yeah, it's in there,
Yeah, and again, like a lot of it's an example, if anything, of an industry that never took off. What could have been, what could have saved Irish distilling? Now, of course, there's a lot of other bad stuff that happened, but there is this strange. I mean, Lloyd George once said the entire, argument between pot stills and column stills was one more manifestation of the recurring arguments between Belfast and Dublin. Now, that's not true when you look deeper into it and you find, there's Cumber out and down making pot still all the time, and North Antrim at Bushmill, and of course Coleraine down the road making malt, both of them. It was a much more muddled picture, but you do have, I think, two different forms of Victorian Ireland that couldn't see eye to eye, and one is provenance-based. One is trying to turn Irish whiskey into a kind of a wine-type product, into a provenance-driven product, into, great old houses. When you have Jameson making Harry Clark pamphlets with, descriptions of chateaus and whatnot, and then you have heavy, capable industrialists. And what happens in Scotland is you see the pretty much near mirror of those industrialists in the urban lowlands, dealing with small, again, only very semi-industrialized operations in the Highlands, and building some sort of cooperative infrastructure. And that never happened. I mean, even our whole idea, we borrow the Scotch terminology, but the idea that like blended products when they came about in Ireland were all made in the one place. They weren't blends in the sense that Walkers were blenders. They were just Middleton trying to replicate various types of product, is kind of it's not the organic blending industry that took off. It's
I've got to jump out here because I have to go for a meeting with Tourism NI before my own bloody tasting this evening. But there was a few people chatting in our group chats earlier, and they really want to know, out of the whiskies that we've tasted in the last couple of days, what do you think your favourite is, and why? And unfortunately, somebody's going to have to tell me what Fionnán says about that, and then I catch up. But I got to go here right now. But Slán.
Well, is anyone able to log on? Because we have one more in the box. So before we answer that question, I want to give them all a fair chance. White's 22, number 8. So second mystery glass.
Hey,
Gareth, are you back on?
I thought I wouldn't see you stuck. Couldn't do that to you, mate. So Brendan has to go to do his own things. So
I think it's good to have you on. You were the one who first took me to White's, the pub. That
should quite possibly be right. That's actually probably quite possibly right. Yeah.
So yeah, great place to end. Again, a curiosity. So when we talk about the failure of a blending industry in Ireland, the other side of that coin was there was a successful bonding industry, a respectable bonders industry, the likes of Green Spot and Redbreast, and even small publican bonders who would claim, that they got good stock because they knew something. The likes of the Palace, all these treasured old, white label relationships with powers in Dublin. There was the small scale proprietor bonders, and that did, again, it was never capable of building an industry. But White seemed to have done something along those lines. The received wisdom is that Whites were getting Bow Street. I'm not sure.
It's a very different animal from the last one. It's a very different animal from the club.
Yeah, it's, and you wonder, okay, so when you see this stuff pop up at auction, people say it's Bow Street. Now, it's very odd that a pub in Belfast will be getting spirit from Bow Street. Not impossible. But also Bow Street made a big deal about being on the label of everything that used them. Green Spot, Redbreast, they all had to say John Jameson as well. And what we get is now whites have the claim of being white's 22-year-old, which is a ridiculous age statement. It was a big deal at the time for even Jameson to say not a drop sold till it's 7 years old. 12-year-old whiskey was a big deal for a running brand like Redbreast. When you start seeing numbers like 22, it indicates that somebody went belly up and had a lot of old stuff, and there were a lot of people going belly up. So it could be Bow Street that they kept on. There also was no real rigid guidelines. It could have been just some 22-year-old whiskey was dipped into something else. This stuff wasn't regulated. It says guaranteed, but as long as you could prove that there was some reason to have it on the label. I'll give it a...
I'm not getting 22 years in the craft or in the palate. It certainly has age, it certainly has age, and there's definitely probably some 20-year-old in there, but I wouldn't have thought that's a straight up 22-year-old.
Yeah, it doesn't strike me as 22. We were having like Dunville's, or not Dunville's, Dungorney 30-year-old. Now that's Bourbon Castle, less aggressive. But you even get like Old Cumber 30-year-old, which is over oaked and ruined. But it doesn't taste like that either. The closest for me that it tastes like this lineup is the Dunvilles, which would make it. Now it could be Dunvilles and Bow Street batted together. It is very odd. Bow Street were very litigious. They tended to sue people for using their name incorrectly or for blending their product or whatever. So it hits a few legal bubbles to see if now it's a pub, so nobody really gives a damn, legally. And again, it could be if whites have paperwork showing back to Bow Street. It could just be old Bow Street left much longer than we're used to, but it could also be Bow Street mixed with something else. Again, 22. Look, Dunville's closed 1936, 46, 56, late 50s. Actually, damn on. This is a 60s bottling. Is actually kind of eerily on the money. They could be mixed together, and that's where the folk memory has come from. Whatever, but they certainly weren't. And one of the odder things I found in Dunville's was that Dunville's had warehousing in Dublin, and during the 20s, I went to a whole book of board member meetings where they're talking about trying to extract stock from warehousing in Dublin. And this was the middle of the Civil War. And they're saying, have things died down? Can we talk to somebody? Can we get this back? Who do we speak to? Whatever. And they're quite pragmatic about it. There's no politics involved. They just say, who do we talk to? Do we talk to Cosgrove? Do we talk to, whatever? How do we get our stuff back? And there was a lot of stray material that was back and forth around the place. So again, it can be quite difficult to find stuff going from one place to another, but there was stuff going from one place from Belfast.
That is that's news to me. I wasn't aware that Dunville's were holding stocks in Dublin. I know that legislation at the time stated that their blending house had to be 3 miles away from the distillery. You weren't allowed to blend whiskey within 2.5 to 3 miles from where it was distilled. So what you'll find is they stored about 10,000 casks on site in the warehouses of the distillery, which is where the Royal Victoria Hospital is now. Whenever you just come into Belfast there from the M1, the majority of their warehousing was in Adelaide Street, Berkeley Street, which is behind the City Hall, about 2.5 miles away, and that's where their blending was carried out. But I was not aware at all about Dublin storage.
I'm firmly of the opinion that legislation before 1930 is largely a helpful suggestion. A lot of this stuff doesn't find hard enforcement. You might have most of it complying, and then somebody new, a bonded warehouse who would give them a good deal, and it seemed the right decision to put stuff somewhere else or whatever. None of them are airtight. You know, they're all pragmatists. They all have small relationships with, you know, proprietors, with bonders, with whatever. You know, and I mean, this is an era where nobody could tell something was Irish or Scotch half the time. Again, the idea that D3L could very well have just blended shed loads of Irish whiskey into hay and told it as Scotch. You know, we're speaking a different language when we talk about, you know, the industry at that time. I mean, people forget, you know, this, what was called the Immature Spirits Act. This is the law that said whiskey had to be 3 years old. That was Lloyd George's government. You know, that's very, very recent legislation. Any of the Victorian stuff is more or less, you know, a landmine or a field of a minefield of, you know, bogus, giblets, lies, half-truths, whatever. It all comes, you know, history is much dirtier and grittier than legal history would lead us to believe. But yeah, they did have stuff down in Dublin, quite possibly with a Dublin bonder, you know, quite possibly supplying to Dublin. You know, there's so many reasons why these things could have happened. But whatever is in this, again, the closest to pot still would be my memory of, like, again, 80s IDL pot still, old casks, musky, that kind of stuff. There's a little bit of genuine pot still resin in there, but that could be if it's done with it. It's coming from there. It does not smell like grain whiskey in the way that the other one smelled like either grain whiskey or a very, very light blend. And what you'd imagine the grain whiskey at the time, you know, the weird, like, refined rye and maize and high malt concoction would give you. Give it a taste.
Do you know, Serge, or do you know, Fionnán, Serge, you asked a question previously, was Dunnevilles potentially a bit over-oaked, over-wooded? I like whiskey with lots of oak and lots of wood. I like whiskey that's version on over-oaked. I think that's what whiskey really should be, you know, in some ways. And that probably has a lot of oak in there. But to be honest, I like it for that. I like the almost over-wooded, over-oaked content in that whiskey. I
mean, you know, and it's funny, you have those, especially with blends, with pot still heavy blends. You know, I have the old Jameson 12 with your man's face on it. I have one in the cupboard, and the stuff is like treacle. You know, it's you gave it to most people, many of whom I've had to the house, they wouldn't want to drink it. It's not, you know, it's a musky, heavy, dusty drink, but it's also entrancing because of that. You have that weird pot still blends with that must have their own weird attraction, and I always thought that began with IDL just inheriting the weight of history with it into the 70s and 80s. The Dunnevilles is the closest I've had to that. Again, these like heavier, oakier, musty products. You know, it's a different kind of whiskey. You'd imagine it sitting on your grand shelf, and, you know, the thing brought down at Christmas, whatever. These or, you know, the stuff you anticipate getting a headache from in the morning. These very weighty liquids. But again, I wish I'd kept some of the Dunnevilles to try side by side, because again, well, I mean, in the comments, where does I think Zoltan is saying rusty bitterness? There is a weird rust that you get with this. It's not, I don't know where that would come from. It's like again, it's a weirdly metallic taste, but it's not sharp. When we say metallic in drink, we usually mean sharp metallic, but this does feel odd. There's flavors that don't exist in contemporary whiskey, and oftentimes when we try old whiskey, we're trying really, really, really aged. In fact, many times overaged. In this country, Irish pot still. But one thing I liked about doing this tasting was we're looking not stuff distilled pre-70s. You know, a lot of what we had yesterday was bottled later on. but what was happening during the 50s and 60s, some of which drags back to the 30s and some of which anticipates the 70s. Yeah, I'd take a logical guess at either Dunvilles or a blend of available materials, including old Dunvilles and maybe a bit of Bow Street. But again, like, they weren't blenders. It's not like they were mixing things together. They were getting what was on hand for the pub. So generally with pub contracts, it's pretty straightforward to get them from one person. So who knows what that could have been. But also keep in mind, IDL were happily slashing bonders contracts, you know, even before McCourt said, right, get rid of every contract, except for some reason, Mitchell's. But again, some of the stuff remains a mystery. It does not, to me, smell like Bow Street. I took a whiff of it last night, and it kind of smelled like Bow Street, but that's really just, upon further inspection, that's really just pot still. There's some pot still kicking around in there. But even the dusty old Bow Street that got lugged into IDL products in the 70s, it doesn't quite smell like. It smells more like them than it does, you know, old Bow Street bottle of Natural. But again, without knowing what it was.
Fionnán, do we know how much of this was ever released? This White's 22?
No idea.
Because what I'm sort of wondering, is it?
Yeah, I think Sergi.
I'm wondering, is it?
It reminds me a little of the Jameson 15 brown label, which is again a lot of inherited stock from old Bow Street in heavier oak than it was used to when it was a Bow Street bottling coming into IDL in the 70s. You know, the Jameson 15, not the notorious millennial bottling, but the 70s one, which was again just dragged over stock. Again, some of this stuff, and it's hard because you're combating, you know, your own nostalgia when you drink this stuff, to think, would I really enjoy this if this came out tomorrow as a product? You know, and some of them, I mean, like that Locks, you know, some of them I would leap at with fangs bared. I'm not sure I would chase this down. It's bewildering and strange to try and put the puzzle together. It's fun. It's nice. It tastes. If we hadn't had the Dunvilles previously, I think I'd be more interested in this one. But I felt like the Dunvilles did this better than this. Again, that musky, as you say, you know, was their port mixed in around musky carpets, heft, etc. And then pot still clearly lurking backstage. Yeah,
that was what I was trying to get at whenever I asked, did you know how much of this come out? Because what I'm wondering is this possibly a Dunville expression or a different expression with just less mixture of cask, with maybe more sherry, less port, or whatever? You know, is this just a different expression that never come out because what these guys were just getting what's available at the time, and it wouldn't have been what was the standard Dunvilles or Bow Street or whatever blend at the time. It's really a snapshot of one or two casks.
Yeah,
and that's very possible.
Absolutely. And I mean, again, 22 syncs up, and it could be, you know, the whole idea that the youngest contents is X number of years. That's legislation that wasn't exactly enforced for most of the 20th or early 20th century, and for a good bit of the middle 20th century here. You could get away with saying, well, here's the contract where we got some 22-year-old liquid somewhere and blah, blah, blah. And half the time people wouldn't look anyway. You know, there's a lot of, the only thing that was really aggressively enforced was the Immature Spirits Act, the idea that everything had to be over 3 years old. And that was partly to do with politics. That was Lloyd George trying to stomp out cheap liquor. I mean, Lloyd George, who was a teetotaler himself, ironically shaped, you know, when we talk about the 3 years minimum for whiskey, that was George's attempt to basically shut down bulk sale column still whiskey and gin, and or whiskey made for gin. Gin never received it, and it ironically shoved the idea of being a premium product down the throats of even the cheapest, shittiest, most nefarious blenders. And it really built Scotch into the premium product, even at the Johnny Walker Red Label bracket that it is. You know, whereas ironically, people still got cheap hard liquor by one means or another. Now it's just vodka or whatever. So, you know, there's it wasn't always the whiskey industry's decision to make customer-friendly choices. But aside from that, a lot of legislation around older age statements, nobody really gave a damn about. You know, they weren't legislating for that. They were legislating for the bottom rung. So again, Dunville's makes a lot of sense to me. The math lines up where you're talking about, okay, we know that it took 12 to 15 years for Dunville's to sell off. That's 1936 to the early 50s. That's when this comes out, or a little, you know, between then and the 60s. You know, it could be Bow Street with some of that tipped in. It could be, you know, whatever. It could just be some around the corner. The idea that they were getting, the other thing that could have happened is they got 22 one year and then just didn't do it again, and they were getting from multiple places. You know, there's so many variables about why something felt qualified to guarantee anything, because again, the closer you look, the less any of this lines up.
Yeah, and I think also whenever you're tasting these old whiskies, and it's a privilege to do so, like I said earlier, you know, I sometimes think, you know, how much of what I'm tasting is what they were aiming for back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and how much is just what it is now. So I think whenever you taste the powers from yesterday, the locks from today, and the Dunvilles possibly less so from today, you sort of imagine, yes, that's what we're tasting in the bottle now is what we're aiming for whenever it was contemporary, you know, in the 30s or 50s or 60s. That's the same flavor profile that they were aiming for. And then other times whenever you taste some of these older whiskies, you think, how has it stood up to 30 years in the bottle, and has it, you know, and I think sometimes, you know, that can confuse the issue too. You know, for me, whenever I'm tasting these whiskies, you know, is this what they were aiming for 30 years ago, 40, 50 years ago? Is this what it tasted like whenever it was contemporary? Or has it suffered, you know, has it suffered a lot for the time it spent in the bottle?
Yeah.
And I think certainly for the locks and for the locks and for the powers and the Dunvilles, you can certainly tie that back to what it was back in the day. With this one, I sort of wonder.
Yeah, give me 2 seconds. I'm just going to fill my cup of water. I'll be back in less than a minute.
Do you know, funny, yeah, Whiskey Jack has just made a comment that there was a crack. Fionnán, there was actually a crack in this bottle, and it was quite a substantial crack the whole way up the bottle. We were very, very careful in handling this bottle that we didn't break it while we were decanting it. And somebody's just asked, would the crack have made any difference? I'm not too sure, but certainly I had forgotten that crack was there. And when this bottle came in, it was cracked from almost top to bottom. And we were quite nervous that it wouldn't actually get as far as being filled. I don't know if that would make a difference or not, and I don't know. Possibly not, but yeah, it's worth mentioning.
Yeah, I mean, and our standards have gone up so high. You know, if one thing has changed dramatically between the 70s, the pre-70s and now, it's wood. You know, wood has gotten, I know, you know, we still have problems with sulfur candling and whatnot, but wood has gotten so much more active in the past half century than it ever was before. And of course, you look at some of these like weighty mash bills, you know, heavy oats, etc. And of course, they were, you know, when you're being drunk 7 years old, it makes sense. Now, of course, now we've got the problem where a lot of, you know, this stuff doesn't perform young in the contemporary industry because it is so heavy and people are used to something a little sweeter, and it needs 7 years minimum. But a lot of this distillate forward whiskey, you know, yes, it has lightened, but similarly, as nostalgic as we get about that, casks have gotten infinitely better. And so sometimes when we try these casks, it's difficult to gauge what could be 22 years old, because 22-year-old, you know, 21-year-old Redbreast has a very different relationship with the cask than like something left around for 20, than, you know, even the like Dungorney 1930, whatever, or 1964 for 30 years. It's an entirely different way of thinking about casks. And I mean, Redbreast 21 was the recipient of, in 1988, IDL under, with Brendan Monk's suggestion, it overhauled their entire inventory to create a more reliable cask strategy. And we're seeing the dividends of that pay off today. So again, casks were A, very variable, and B, not always as reliable, and C, as you said, not necessarily intended to hold whiskey for that long. So it's always, I mean, I'm trying I saved some of the Paddy's blend just to try it against the last two. And as light as it is, sandwiched between two very impressive pot stills and Dunvilles, who are again producing what I think is a more impressive answer to this. It might have seemed out of the way, but comparing it to these last two, seeing a blend that was made to be a blend and put out on its own terms and whatnot, you can see people reacting to it as a fresher product, as a more, something less likely to give you a headache, something more inviting. And I mean that, oh my God, that Cork Distillers pot still just still shine, like a pulsing heartbeat when you swallow the Paddy blend. So again, it's a mix. The past is a different country, and there's a lot of stuff that happened. And as fun as it is, and we can find some real treasures from the past and stuff that can be revived or played with. And then there's stuff that was an accident of history and anything in between, Any thoughts?
Yeah, the more time I spend with this whites, the more I think that it probably is 22 years old, because certainly the more time I spend with it, the more that dry spice I'm getting through from it. That would suggest that it has spent 22 years in the barrel. So I will probably revise my comment from earlier, because the more time that I spent with it, I am getting that sort of drier spice coming through that would suggest time in wood. But like you said, wood influence, what we have in wood influence today and what we have in wood influence 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago is there's little to no comparison. When you look at some of the like even some of the Dead Rabbit blend, and how much wood influence they get in that for a 4 to 5 year product. I'm just saying that because I tasted it last night, and I hadn't had it for a year or two, and it just jumped out at just how much sweetness there was there from the bourbon cask and how much wood influence come in there. And wood influence now is completely different. We're using different casks, but we're also using casks that are seasoned very differently.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
We're using casks that are a lot of casks that are seasoned specifically for whiskey these days. I
mean, we're using, first of all, very exotic stuff, but actually the past was more exotic than we think. But again, largely by just historical happenstance. But as you said, and there's a lot of, my pulse beats a bit quicker for distillate-driven whiskey, but that doesn't mean that, again, that cask element has gotten so much better. It always annoys me, it irritates me no end when I hear people talk about, the cask is the only thing that matters, blah, I know it's kind of bullshit.
I think
you can see where they're getting that, because the casks are so incredibly active today, and they do play an enormous role. And I mean, they always have played an enormous role. But
in fairness, I think that's why the Powers 30-year-old stood out so much yesterday. The Powers 30-year-old was just a perfect example of what is still a very distillate-driven whiskey. And certainly that 30-year-old Powers from yesterday's pre-70s tasting, it was all about the distillate. And that's why that one stood out so much yesterday.
No, absolutely. I mean, they were, even Cork Distillers Company, that Dungurney 30, the distillate was so robust, so, again, even for something triple distilled, wide cut, hefty at birth. And I think through a variety of strategies, Irish whiskey would move away from that in the 80s, and especially the 90s, where the distillate gets lighter, the casks get more important, the vanilla from the bourbon cask gets more, you get a lot of first fill. I mean, there's a lot of products that are reliant on bourbon barrel sweetness, and then never mind the exotic stuff, and covering up for not very interesting bases with sweetness, and again, not to be too critical, because there's a lot of crap from the past as well. But I think distillers working today, there's a marriage there so readily available of extracting or engaging with the best of the past and equipping it.
Well, Fionnán, I was about to ask you a question that you just touched on. I'm about to ask you a question. I mean, we've now spent 2 days with 12 whiskies from the last 60 years of Irish whiskey, from the 30s through to the 70s or 80s. All these young distilleries and all these young distillers, and certain and even established distilleries, you know, I mean, if you could take something from the older style of whiskey from the last 2 days tasting and say, here's what young distilleries and startups can learn from the last 2 days or from those 60 years we've covered, what do you think the lessons are that maybe, you know, the Acklandvilles and the Colognes and maybe even a lot more of the more established distilleries should be taking from this liquid?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest, I mean, and again, as you know, I think all the mash bills everywhere should be made perfectly available to anyone who wants to engage with them now. But even aside from, you know, mashes, you know, talking about oats or any specific grain, the confidence to know that even at 7 years old, you know, even young, wide cut, not to be afraid of distillate forward whiskey, of taking a risk on a wider cut or something that's a bit heftier at birth or double distilling or whatever. A lot of these heavyweights can still be charming and inviting, never mind like appealing to the obsessives who want some sort of powers type juice on steroids and, you know, oily, musky, whatever. There's plenty of, you know, delicacy, finesse even in some of these, again, more confident, spirits driven distillates. And who's to say, I mean, what that could do with contemporary wood is anyone's guess, you know, what these old mashes could provide. So that's unclaimed territory. But even talking about in a sherry barrel for 7 years, you know, these confident whiskies, A, can be brilliant, but B, can be inviting. You know, it's not, people shouldn't be timid. You know, it's was the opening of the Abbey Theatre. Yeats said, you know, be bold, be bolder still, be yet more bold, but not too bold. You know, they can be extremely entrancing at this and beguiling and inviting at the same time as being enormously confident, as enormously intricate, you know, and I think there's a lot there to pull from.
Yeah, no, I think that's as good a way as any to sign off. You know, I mean, I think.
Grand, yeah.
I know that we always try and look to the past to see what we can learn. You know, the Cumber mash bills that we're doing, one example of that. You know, a lot of guys are doing it now. I think Irish whiskey will be a lot richer for it. And yeah, I think we should, you know, anybody that's tasting this old whiskey should learn from it, and not, you know, it's not just an experience; it's a learning curve. You know, for my take on it.
Absolutely. And of course, like, you know, these are past references. I think what was really lost was not even the mash bills themselves. It was the language. It was the, for want of a better word, the dialectic of what these mashes meant, what it meant to increase the output or to not use wheat or whatever, you know, that entire logic has been lost and needs to be rediscovered. And I think specific old mash bills certainly help in facilitating the reclamation of that knowledge. But again, there's a lot out there, you know. And I think
I also think.
Go on.
I also think sometimes that we've lost. Would bravado be the right word? We've lost the bravado. We've lost the confidence, and, you know, possibly a bit to do these big mash bills. And I know that there's, you know, I know that everybody talks about the GI and legislation, et cetera, et cetera. My own, you know, I don't talk a lot about that. My own view is that we'll put out a Cumber mash bill in 5 years' time with yourself, Fionnán. It'll be an old Cumber pot still, and the fact that we can't call a pot still will just speak volumes. And I think that whenever there's more and more historical pot stills go out that can't be called pot stills, it will have to change. Because the idea that there can be a contemporary old Cumber pot still mash bill, that old Cumber was one of the very essences of pot still. You know, it was one of the pot still whiskies, the most famous pot still whiskies, and the idea that you should follow their mash bill and distillation techniques exactly and can't draw the pot still is just folly. And I think that will change in time, because it will have to, because the more and more of these that come out and highlight that issue, you know, is going to change it. You know, speaking of which, there's Brendan Carney right back in just on time.
It's working.
It's funny. I mean,
but yeah, we need, you know, I hope to see that confidence up bravado come back in this side. You know, in these big bold mash bills, this is as good as any of the more refined mash bills out there, if not better, and have a confidence to put them out. And certainly Brendan has an abundance of that.
No, absolutely, and I thoroughly agree with you, Charles. And for those listening, so the Cumber mash bill was a bit of an exciting story. So it propped up. I was in the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland, PRONI, and Cumber was listed on the files, and they didn't have it. And they said, sorry, we don't have that. And then I went back to my desk and I started, you know, you have to go in with the white gloves and log in and log out. And I was looking at Dunville stuff, actually. And anyway, this guy comes to the box. And, you know, we found this in the basement, knocked itself out. And mash bill, distillation regimen, huts, everything. I mean, the most in-depth distilling archive, I think, is publicly available. And Jarlath and Graham and the gang have been distilling it, you know, to the cut point level. It's fascinating to see that happen. But yes, when we talk about legislation in whiskey, you know, and again, the whiskey is the whiskey. You know, the chemical animal of the whiskey is not subject to the whims of the GI. What the GI is important for is bolstering that bravado, as you say, for creating financial confidence that people can be yet more bold, as it were. Because when you talk to distillers, unless you're Brendan Carty and you want to burn down the Opera House, you know, most distillers will just say, well, look, I'd make it if I could, but I'm not going to, I can't afford on my business plan to make liquid that is going to be mistaken for a blend. And so they don't make it. And it stands to reason. And they won't make it, with notable exception, you know, and it's unfair to them as well as then, you know, to the customer, that we don't engage for all the bullshit that we come up with about faux heritage and, you know, Celtic magic crap about, you know, Irish whiskey's past, some of which, you know, offends me as a historian, but really offends me as a human being. Yeah, it's just cringeworthy embarrassing.
Like the awkward rant I put up on Facebook the other day.
Oh yeah, it's so. I mean, half of it is such horseshit. But and again, like, as I hope people here will agree with me, industrial history is really cool and worth its own interest on its own rights, and the weird mix of whiskey as this intersection between industrialization, industrial pragmatism, flavor proprietorship versus, you know, blending canny capitalism versus whatever mix of forces, and what flavors came out of that at any given time and what they have to offer us today. That's fucking fascinating. And it deserves, when we're talking about the revival of Irish whiskey, it deserves more genuine attention. And it's not that complicated. You know, if we were to talk sincerely about the GI, either if I woke up in horror tomorrow, as I said yesterday, and discovered I had, like in a Kafkaesque nightmare, you know, woken up and found I was the Board of Agriculture. And the first thing I would do would be to change that GI. And what I would do is, you know, 30% malt and 30% raw barley is actually a healthy minimum. That works quite well. Historically, you had about 30% other stuff. If you want to be really conservative, you can police it internally and say, okay, no more than 10% rye, 20% wheat, and 30% oat. It's really an inclusive or a strict definition. But, you know, when you start alienating the ancestor brands, the whole reason why pot still is treated separately than malt whiskey at all. And it's hilarious because that was in jeopardy during the 90s itself. When Cooley set up, Cooley were putting out single malt products saying pure pot still. And actually, for all the crap about the GI, you buy a bottle of Locks today, it still says pure pot still. I don't know if anyone's ever noticed. for all this mess about the GI, there's still a few things coming out that say pure pot still single malt. And I don't even know if the owners, are terribly attentive of that. But it's a mess. And I think when you're sincere and open and inviting about this stuff, it's so much easier to encourage interested new distillers who might not have ready access to historical materials to play, to think what they can do. I think that's important now, to encourage that bravado, to encourage that, that confidence, because Irish whiskies lacked confidence for so long. And the fact that we put out so many sweet to the point of banality products, dare I say it, has been in the past a sign of reactionary business. Now there's some wonderful stuff that's come along every decade as well, but timidity is not what built that history in the first place.
Well,
yeah, I know that. I mean, us and
sure,
others will, we will put out that. Oh, sorry, Brennan.
Go ahead.
Brennan, are we in your podcast? Are we in your webcast now? This is your time now, is it?
It's all right.
Is this my turn?
I don't have anything.
Who's on next? Matt Healy or somebody?
I think, at 4 o'clock. This is you're at 4 o'clock.
Right, well,
right, Fionnán,
there's a time.
I'm going to sign off and let the man that is Brennan Carty have the main stage.
It's important you guys are here because obviously, Fionnán's had a massive influence on the doctrine of Cologne from day one. Before he even knew that we were planning a distillery, I was basically sponging in everything that he was spewing out. And then we're also tasting some of the fantastic stuff that you were doing with Jarlath. With the wheat-based stuff, your early days distillate, the Whiskey Live, for example. So it's amazing that we're running from this into Cologne because it's a continuation of that thought, and hopefully this will just continue to gain momentum as this Irish whiskey boom continues to grow. So
yeah.
Right, Brennan, I'm going to sign off. Good luck with your tasting.
All right,
I'll grab my tasting kit here. Cheers, Fionnán.